I think the idea of aliens or other sentient beings existing either out in space or on other planets has intrigued the human race for quite some time now. There's the famous Roswell incident, the award-winning film E.T., and of course the most recent headlines a few years back that the Pentagon released video footage of UFOs. For whatever reason, even though we haven't nearly perfected or come close to understanding humans and our psyche, we are enamored with the idea of finding aliens. But what if aliens aren't friendly? What if instead of big green heads with big black eyes and thin, frail green bodies, they're much scarier? Maybe they look like an H.P. Lovecraft creation. Or maybe they look like something just as terrifying. Today on Life's Biggest Questions, we're asking, what if NASA discovers an SCP on Mars? Now, with all the excitement about NASA getting their rover to Mars and snapping those high-def pics, there's obviously been some chatter of what if they actually find something? I mean, after all, that's the goal. The mission here is to determine whether or not at some point there was any form of life on Mars, with NASA's rover named Perseverance looking for past microbial life. Of course, they're not just looking for aliens, but also trying to learn more about Mars and space in general. And while on their search, let's just say that the rover gets attacked or is able to snap photos of a being that we've never seen anything like before. Now, here's where things get a little tricky for me. Which SCP did they find? Given that there are thousands of entries, it's hard to really pinpoint which one they would find and why. The good news is not every single SCP is necessarily from space, but again, there are a lot of them who reside up there. And with that in mind, rather than focus on what if NASA discovered one specific SCP, this video is going to be more curated to what happens if they find any SCP up there, regardless of their ability. Now, the SCP's abilities do need to be accounted for at some capacity because some are much more hostile than others. I think it's safe to say that, depending on the power and mood of said SCP, the discovery could either lead to incredible things or the destruction of the world as we know it. But let's just say the SCP NASA discovers on Mars is neutral. It's not necessarily friendly, but also not aggressive. It's kind of just there. At first, the rover would likely approach the SCP, which could potentially scare it off. From this point on, the top scientists and researchers at NASA would likely helm the project and potentially would be under a lot of pressure to bring whatever was found on Mars back home. Whether or not this would be possible would need to be determined, but it seems more likely than not that NASA would try. It's also possible that rather than trying to capture the SCP and potentially lose it on the way back to Earth, they try to find other ways of communicating with it. See, the idea of finding an SCP, or really any alien or extraterrestrial, doesn't always need to end with them coming to Earth and taking over. It's a rather boring way of things playing out, but it's quite possible we make the next discovery and then for the next however many years, just try to interact and learn more and communicate and understand the SCP from afar. While we're on Earth and it's still residing on Mars, NASA would likely continue to send over other types of technology, similar to their rover, in an effort to work with the SCP. Given that it'd be the only of its kind, assuming there weren't more, I'd like to think NASA and the governments involved in this new project would do whatever they could to save and preserve this thing. I mean, if anything were to happen to it, then what? Sure, we'd have its corpse to study and I'm sure we'd learn a lot, but would you guys rather learn about dinosaurs by looking at fossils or studying a living, breathing one? You can learn a lot more about things when they're alive because at some point, they'll be dead too. All in all, I think it's safe to say that if NASA were to stumble upon an SCP, or any alien for that matter, they would do all they could to try and communicate with it. In regards to the media, I'm not sure if this story would be confidential or not. On one hand, the media and publication of such a story would excite people all over the world and could potentially allow for more funding as well as interest in the field in general. On the flip side, it could lead to people doing things in hopes of going viral or just making some money. Examples of this would be faking an alien sighting on Earth or something along those lines. Now, as we've seen, especially over the last few years, people will do anything to go viral. I mean, licking toilet seats during a pandemic, putting Gorilla Glue in your hair. So the idea of making a hoax alien video isn't far-fetched at all. I mean, we got Bigfoot videos, don't we? All in all, I think it's pretty safe to say if NASA found an SCP on Mars, the world would freak out. However, we wouldn't even know what it was we were about to be dealing with, much like our pandemic, which I genuinely thought would be over after a month or two, and yet here we are a year later. The beauty of the unknown is just that. Anything could happen, and we have absolutely no idea what to expect. And I think it's fair to say that's exactly how things would play out with an SCP, or really any extraterrestrial being we come across. Now, as always, guys, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this one down below. For now, let's reply to some comments from the video. Top 10 newest SCPs in 2021. Darko Matter said, nobody. Some people. Early! I never understood that. Can you guys explain? I've asked this many times in videos with this whole early thing. Why do people care? Maybe if you're like a young kid, it's exciting, but I don't know. James 003 said SCP Foundation personnel. Here we go again. Classic GTA. Just gotta get my tank top on. Scorpion Dipop said, if I make an SCP, will y'all cover it? Depends. If it's popular and it's one people like and talk about, 100%, I'd love to. So make it good. All right, guys, that's all for this one. I've been your host, Jared Bronstein. We'll see you soon.